Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be about the Bible code, a numerical code found throughout the pages of the Bible that until now no one has been able to decipher. What I am about to tell you in this video series is going to be some of the most important information that has been made available to mankind since the completion of the Bible nearly 2,000 years ago. It is very likely that within our lifetimes, events are going to take place that no one alive is prepared for. But with the information in this video, a person can be prepared. Once you hear what I am about to say, much of the Bible that never really made sense before will suddenly make perfect sense. Occasionally, someone will ask me about one of the so-called lost books of the Bible, and for the most part, I simply try to avoid making blanket statements about anything, unless I have to. So when asked about a document such as the Book of Enoch, instead of telling someone to avoid it, I will usually say something about how it is a good book to read after reading the Bible. In the course of my search for truth, I have read many of the so-called lost books of the Bible, if not all of them, and at one time could not figure out why they were not included in the Bible or even why other books were included. I simply took it on blind faith that our all-powerful God could ensure that His Word would somehow be protected and preserved in some kind of easy-to-acquire form. Even today, much of why I believe that our Bible contains all of the books that God intended and none of the ones that He didn't is mostly based on faith. However, I no longer consider that faith to be blind. Now, when I read one of the so-called lost books, it is usually very easy to quickly figure out that something is not quite right. There are quite a few numbers recorded in most of the so-called lost books, but when stories containing numbers from the lost books are compared to the stories containing numbers from the books of the recognized Bible canon, the code becomes, for the most part, nonsensical. For the most part, I am confident that I, at least to some extent, understand the stories containing numbers as found in the Bible. Not so with the books outside of the Bible. Unlike religious people, lists of random rules, magic formulas, or stories of miraculous events written in Old English don't automatically inspire spiritual people. But participating in religion has been a large part of my own spiritual growth. Had I not read those books that were left out of the Bible, including many books of the so-called mythological stories from other religions around the world, I might not have ever figured out why they didn't actually fit in, and as a result, I might not have ever developed the ability to recognize the hidden Bible code. The books of the Bible as they exist today are nothing like what was available to the people that worshiped God in the past. It is only within the last 2,000 years that a recognized list of Bible books has become available. In the earliest days of human history, prior to Jesus coming to the earth, many of the recognized books of the Bible canon did not even exist because they had not yet been written. For most people living at that time, the books that did exist were not available as a single complete collection. The individual books that make up our Bible were written by many men living in many lands over a period of thousands of years in multiple languages. Some of the men that wrote those books, in all likelihood, did not even have access to the books that had been written by the others. That being the case, in many instances, the men who wrote the books of the Bible would have had no way to ensure what they were writing matched the other books of the Bible. But it was amazing, and even as impossible as it may seem, each and every one of those men wrote into their individual books a numerical code that would have been impossible for even they themselves to recognize. And the code in all of those books matches up to tell one unified story. This video series will not explain every detail of the code. I don't even imagine that all of the code will be understood by anybody prior to the restoration of the earth. But what it does explain will make it possible for you to at least recognize the code when you see it, and hopefully over time you will start to be able to see how the parts of the Bible code in one book work with the parts of that code from the other books. In Matthew chapter 24 and beginning at verse 3, Jesus' apostles come to him privately and ask him what would be the sign of his coming and of the end of the age. Part of what Jesus says is directly related to the Bible code. See that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am anointed, and they will lead many astray. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the anointed one, or there he is, do not believe it. For false anointed ones and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. These words are only part of the account. If you go back and read this account in its entirety, you will see many familiar scriptures about things that the churches repeat on a regular basis. Beginning at verse 6, Jesus says, You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Jesus spoke about these things after being asked by his apostles what would be a sign of your presence in the end of the age. So the churches, claiming to be anointed by God, say that the sign of his presence would be these wars, famines, and earthquakes. If a person had never been in a church in their life and had never heard any of the teachings of Christendom, and they were given a copy of these verses to read, there is no way that they would ever come to the conclusion that wars, famines, and earthquakes were signs of Jesus' return, because what these verses very clearly say is that things such as wars, famines, and earthquakes are not going to be signs of Jesus' return. In fact, it also very clearly says that if someone is telling you that wars, famines, and earthquakes are signs of Jesus' return, then in fact that person or organization has not been anointed by God to speak in his name. In other words, a false prophet. Christendom falsely teaches that these scriptures were put in the Bible in order to warn so-called Christians about the presence of false Christ and false prophets outside of the established church hierarchy in the last days, when in reality exactly the opposite is true. These verses were put in our Bible as a way of exposing Christianity's religious system as false, and its end times prophecies as false as well. When I was associated with the Jehovah's Witnesses, these verses were brought up at nearly every meeting. At the turn of the century, the witnesses were teaching that Christ would return in 1914. When World War I broke out, it was taken as proof that this date was correct and that Christ had begun to rule invisibly from heaven. Those living at that time believed that they would soon witness the resurrection of the dead. When the resurrection did not take place, they attributed it to the fact that all of these initial signs were only the birth pains, as it says at verse 8 of most English translations of the Bible. However, there isn't really any linguistic connection between the birth pains of verse 8 and events associated with the timing of the last days, and especially not the period following Christ's return or presence. It would be much more reasonable to associate Jesus' use of the word birth pain with events leading up to the birth of God's kingdom, not with any kind of pain after the establishment of that kingdom. Jesus made it quite clear at John chapter 16 and verse 21 that when a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16 makes a somewhat cryptic reference to this pain as well, when God tells Eve, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children." This verse had a twofold meaning in regard to the actual pain of childbearing, but primarily in regard to the birth of creation. Many of the prophets spoke of the time leading up to the establishment of that kingdom as a time of birth pain. At Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 17 it says, "Like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pains when she is near to giving birth, were we because of you, O Lord." The birth pangs that Isaiah was experiencing hundreds of years before Christ's birth would have been the same birth pangs that Jesus was speaking of. Hosea chapter 13 and verse 13, Micah chapter 4 and verse 9, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 3 all speak of the pain experienced by humanity under Satan's rulership as birth pains. It could be said that all of human history leading up to the establishment of God's kingdom should be considered as part of those birth pains. A lot of very bad things happened at the turn of the 20th century, including such things as war, natural disasters, famine, and pestilence. But if a person were to separate themselves from any religious doctrines on such things and look at human history with an open mind, it isn't hard to see that overall there has not been any clearly definable increase or decrease in such things, ever. The number of casualties in World War I was greater than any previous war, I think. But the Earth's population was greater than it had ever been previously as well, and the percentage of the Earth's landmass dominated by civilization was also greater. Add to that the fact that over time weapons had been becoming increasingly more efficient, and it is quite easy to see that what we were perceiving as signs of the last days is quite similar to what has been perceived as signs of the last days for all of human history. At Romans chapter 8 and verse 22, Paul confirmed that the birth pains time period was not associated with the last days, but instead with all of human history leading up to the last days. He said, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." So even in the first century, these birth pains had already been going on for 4,000 years, and Jesus said that those birth pains would continue all the way up until the last days, a period that thus far has lasted nearly 6,000 years. Paul confirmed this when he said at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 3, "While people are saying there is peace and security, then suddenly destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape." the discomfort associated with pregnancy that began when Adam and Eve were forced out of the Garden of Eden will conclude when that pain escalates to actual labor pains at Armageddon. This does not mean that we cannot know when the last days are upon us. After speaking of all of the things that would not be signs of His return, Jesus explained what would be signs of His return, and the signs that He gave were so beyond anything that any living human has ever experienced that most of us refuse to even acknowledge them as being within the realm of possibility. And the way that these signs are translated into English seems to be describing the total annihilation of our entire universe. I promise you that will not be the case. Jesus referred to this event as the sign of the Son of Man. The way that He described it indicates that recognizing it is one of the most important things that a person needs to be able to do. Let the one who is on the housetops not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. In the near future, being able to recognize events leading up to the sign of the Son of Man will be essential for anyone wishing to survive what is about to come upon this earth. As Jesus continued at chapter 24 of Matthew, beginning at verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Every religion that I have ever been involved with says that this part of Jesus' teaching is figurative, although being somewhat misleading due to some translation problems. I promise you that it is in no way figurative. This event is spoken of throughout the Bible, and the Bible code is an integral part of understanding exactly what the sign of the Son of Man is. Now that we know what that sign is not, it is vitally important that we do, in fact, find out what it is. In the next video in this series, I will be talking about parts of the code that are easy to spot and which most are not able to understand. It is very important that you watch this video as well in order to prepare for the parts that are more difficult to understand. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.